We are very, very happy to be joined once again here on the show by Zoe Alexandra, who is the editor of People's Dispatch and an excellent journalist who's done quite a bit of reporting from Brazil over the years. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Glad to be back.
Well, great to have you. Here we have the sort of two titans of the Western Hemisphere facing off. President Donald Trump has announced 50% tariffs on Brazil in addition to other tariffs, mainly, it seems, because of the legal proceedings against former President Jair Bolsonaro around a coup. So maybe just to start here with what Trump is saying, because I've heard a lot of different things. I mean, he's raised these 50% tariffs, but it's not on all products or different things like that. So, I mean, what is Trump actually doing, and what is at least the potential impact that could have on Brazil and Brazilian people?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an interesting development to say it like that. Essentially, a couple of weeks back, Trump published this letter saying that the Brazilian government, led by Workers' Party President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was unfairly persecuting Jair Bolsonaro. And because of that, the U.S. was going to impose 50% tariffs and demand that Jair Bolsonaro be kind of given immunity, and people who had been tried in the January 8th, 2023 attempted coup be let go. This has been a long-standing demand of the far right in Brazil, and I think it's important to point out that there's actually personal connections between the family of Donald Trump and the family of Jair Bolsonaro, in addition to a lot of parallels in terms of their politics, in terms of them both having some sort of involvement in an attempted coup. So it's quite interesting. And then also, at the same time, in addition to the 50% tariff, there were sanctions imposed on the Supreme Court Justice Alexandra de Moraes, who has been kind of the main figure that the right wing has consistently attacked because of his efforts to uphold democracy in a lot of ways, his efforts to defend the electoral system, his role in prosecuting Jair Bolsonaro and other things. I remember being on the streets in Brazil covering a Bolsonaro march ahead of the elections, and they would have kind of effigies of Alexandre de Moraes all over the street. So he's like a main target of the far right in Brazil. And so, this slew of measures, of course, has the political motivation of, trying to alleviate pressure on Bolsonaro, who's currently in house arrest. But also, I think I'd be remiss to say that it doesn't have this larger attempt to kind of undermine Brazil as a major player on the world stage in terms of the creation of multilateral institutions, and Lula's commitment to actually building different structures that don't favor the United States.
So, Zoe, I'm curious, just to kind of like zoom into domestically in Brazil, how is Bolsonaro responding, and does he still have like a significant base that he's able to mobilize in his defense, particularly in the street?
Yeah, well, his response has been unsurprising. He does, as I said, in 2022 during the elections, he does have a capacity to mobilize, and he's had this like section of the population that's extremely far right, ideologues of Bolsonaro, and people who, for example, support the military dictatorship, think that everything that happened in Brazil to undermine democracy, to torture left-wing activists, that was okay. These are people who, had gone to the parliament floor and said that, torture, Bolsonaro himself saying that torturing Dilma Rousseff was fine. And so this kind of hard right ideologues are definitely still supporting Bolsonaro because, as part of his whole attempt to undermine the 2022 elections, he created this narrative for over a year saying that, and even before that, saying that the electronic voting system was fraudulent and that, there needed to be military intervention to save Brazilian institutions. And so this is a long time coming. That base, the people that invaded like Brasilia and attempted to overthrow the government on January 8th, those people are still supporting him. We also saw on the floor of the parliament, pretty intense protests of parliamentarians putting bandages on their face, saying that we're being silenced, that this is persecution. They also attempted to interrupt the proceedings of Parliament and to not allow session to take place and to really like disturb, the procedures of the Parliament, of democracy. So there is that base, but at the same time, Lula is actually at a record high level of approval. People are seeing the attacks not only from Donald Trump in the form of tariffs and saying that we want your judiciary to change its decisions and prosecute the way that we want you to prosecute, but also understanding that Bolsonaro's role in Brazil was extremely destructive. Not only was it the January 8th attempted coup in 2023, but Bolsonaro was also responsible for how Brazil managed COVID, responsible for blocking the arrival of vaccines in the country, and so many other things that he's been under a lot of scrutiny for. And now they're seeing, okay, and even now we're trying to improve the country, trying to, grow the economy, develop relationships with other countries, and Bolsonaro is still trying to disrupt things. So I think there is this base of support that he has, but the population is actually really not supporting his actions to kind of disrupt democracy and disrupt the justice system.
I think sort of the backdrop of this, of course, is, Brazil, the first B of the BRICS, and Lula, of course, many, many years ago was one of the key factors in bringing the BRICS alliance together. And this year is the BRICS presidency, the past meeting. Obviously, there was already, even prior to this, sort of a big push around making BRICS more of a forum for the global South. I think it was the very first time the BRICS declaration even mentioned the global South. But Lula's also been in Moscow this year. He's also been in Beijing this year, at least ostensibly. President Xi will be there later in the year for the COP30 around the environment. So, it feels like this is also accelerating, Zoe, this sort of, as Lula calls it, what he wants to see, a world that's based on multilateralism, and that he's using this as an opportunity to continue to push forward the idea of cooperation, especially between global South countries, between each other, in the face of people like Trump who are trying to, bully much of the world, including many of the BRICS nations, into trying to do anything separate than just be subordinate to the United States and Europe.
Yeah, I think it's no accident that this year Brazil hosted the BRICS summit. It's going to host COP30. Even the day after Donald Trump sends this letter and says we're going to impose 50% tariffs. On one hand, you have Lula giving interviews saying that we believe in a world where the dollar is not dominant. We believe in the world where the United States cannot bully the countries of the global South. But on the other hand, you also had mass street mobilizations that had initially been called, on one hand, to demand that the Congress approve taxing big fortunes and end the 6-day work week, which has been a major push of progressive members of Parliament. But also added to this was this kind of massive rejection of the U.S. meddling in the country, and kind of this rebuilding of an anti-imperialist sentiment, seeing directly that, Brazil is not the only country that is facing threats of tariffs, that's facing, statements from Donald Trump saying that they should change the way that they run their country, that their justice system works. And I think it's really waking up, not only kind of within Lula, who has been quite firm in response to Donald Trump, but also amongst the population. And as Brazil goes forward and continues to, intensify its role in institutions like the BRICS, like in CELAC, and like in these forums calling for, environmental justice, I think that Lula is going to be only more and more radicalized. And there's a lot of weight put onto this COP30 this year. Brazil, of course, has the largest part of the Amazon in South America. Lula has been a big proponent of protecting the environment, of the need to kind of respect the environment, indigenous populations, Black communities in Brazil. And so he's going into COP not as a rubber stamp on saying, yeah, sure, we're going to do the mitigation and prevention fund. Sure, we're going to work towards this, but actually there's going to be significant pressure, and not just from him, but from his environmental minister, from the people's movements in Brazil, to actually confront the global North that's been responsible for climate change, that's responsible for these tariffs, and actually say, okay, not only Lula, but the Brazilian people want change and are not satisfied with the US dominated world order.
Zoe, I want to ask you, just with all of this is happening, with of course the backdrop of this ongoing horrific, just apocalyptic genocide in Gaza. And I'm curious if in any way this horror that the U.S. is essentially responsible for by, arming Israel and giving it all the impunity and cover in the world to continue doing this, to not just to Gaza, but to just kill everybody around it. If that is impacting the way perhaps some of these countries that have been asserting themselves a bit more in recent years or over the last decade are dealing or willing to deal with the U.S. in terms of standing up to it.
Yeah, I mean, Brazil has also been a country that has been very vocal on the world stage in terms of condemning Israel's genocide in Gaza, condemning U.S. support to the genocide. I think the movements in Brazil, especially because of the long history of left-wing movements, but also a pretty sizable Lebanese population in the country, there's been repeated mobilization condemning this on one hand. And yeah, I think that we've seen a lot of the global South countries speaking up in defense of Palestine, rejecting Israel in a way that, is in a lot of ways unprecedented from before. On one hand, of course, responding to the atrocity, but also I think understanding that this is imperialism laid bare. This is exactly how, a lot of the United States and Israel would like to deal with countries, just completely crush them. And I think people are understanding that it's not just because Israel wants to crush Palestine and Palestinians, but this is kind of the world order they're creating, ruling by force, extinguishing people's aspirations, people's dream for freedom, for liberation. And of course, this is not just about, one place, but really this is the way that Israel, the United States, views the world. And this is, of course, completely contradictory to any sort of advancement of the global South and of a future of peace.
Just really quickly before we let you go in the last couple of minutes, Zoe, I mean, in the context of this, when Trump came into office, the idea was that it was going to be a big push for the right wing in Latin America. We're obviously seeing that's not happening with Brazil, you just mentioned. Alvaro Uribe, the former president of Colombia, also sentenced to house arrest. I mean, do you see this as kind of part of a broader trend in the continent where things are maybe moving in a different direction than what people had expected?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of zigs and zags. There's advances, there's setbacks. Javier Milei, of course, is a major setback in terms of the continent. Argentina being one of the kind of cornerstones of leading the integration project. Javier Milei really sets that back. But what we've seen in Brazil in terms of Jair Bolsonaro actually being prosecuted, and in Colombia with Álvaro Uribe really actually facing some consequences for all of the crimes that he's committed against the people of Colombia is definitely, I think, giving people hope and giving people confidence. Uribe is someone who committed unspeakable crimes, was responsible for the false positive scandals where young people were killed and dressed up as guerrilla fighters, disappeared from their homes. He led a campaign of demonizing human rights organizations, demonizing social movements, carrying out extermination campaigns. And finally, this year, he was actually proved guilty for having lied and bribed witnesses, essentially proving that he was linked to paramilitary groups in the country. And this is, the fact that it took 3 decades of his crime, later, 2 decades since he was president, really shows okay, this person who acted as if he could get away with really anything, who wiretapped journalists, who wiretapped human rights defenders, has finally actually realized that he is not invincible, that, the justice system will actually work against him, and that he will finally have to pay for his crimes. I think with both cases of Bolsonaro and with Uribe, this is scraping the surface of the crimes that they're responsible for. This is really the beginning of actually bringing justice. And we've seen in countries like Argentina, the struggle for real justice and memory is a decades-long struggle. I mean, 30,000 people tortured and disappeared in Argentina, and now you have a president who says that actually that number is not true, these human rights defenders are crazy. But that struggle continues. And so there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be advances. But I think with these two people, they're people who were seen as untouchable. And that's breaking down a little bit. So there's a lot more to be done. And, with, of course, the force of the United States looming over them, trying to impede these processes of justice from actually taking place. But the will of the people is pushing it forward. And I think that's inspiring not only for people in the continent, but also in the United States.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate you, as always, breaking all this down. Zoe Alexandra, editor of People's Dispatch. You can check it all out at peoplesdispatch.org. They go in depth on all of these different questions. As always, thanks so much for joining us.